Is it wet?
Is it? Great to see everybody this morning. Thank you for joining us and spending some time in our Bible study together today. We are having this discussion about worship scenes. Again, we talked a lot about Old Testament scenes. We're talking about New Testament scenes now. We had a pretty good discussion out of Acts chapter 20 on Wednesday night. I don't plan to rehash all of that this morning, but may give at least a moment for any leftover thoughts out of Acts chapter 20. And then I want to move into 1 Corinthians chapter 11 because it's quite a contrast between the kinds of things that were happening, what we might call in legitimate ways in places like Acts chapter 20. But Corinth had some issues. Their worship services had become something completely other than what God really had intended for them. And so it's valuable for us to learn from their mistakes, if you will, and appreciate the challenges that they brought to themselves because of some of the choices and decisions they had made as it relates to their worship. And so we'll do that this morning. We'll continue our discussion as it relates to those things. But before we begin, if you would, let's bow our heads together and let's share in a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, thank you for the day. Thank you for the blessings that you always bestow upon us. We are humbled by the opportunity to be in your presence today. We're humbled by this opportunity to study your word, to appreciate your testimony, and to just gain an understanding of how worship occurred in the New Testament, lessons you taught your people, instructions that the apostles provided. We just want to honor that and to honor you in the fashion and the way that you have described and brought to us in the pages of your word. Strengthen us in our worship service today as well. Guide us in every righteous endeavor. Thank you for Jesus, and it's through His name that we pray. Amen. Okay, so we learned lots of things, right, out of Acts chapter 20, and we ran lots of paths Wednesday night in that discussion in trying to understand it. But the primary thing we wanted to understand was this was a moment of structured worship, right? I want to make sure we come back to that because that's the reason I added that text. Although it lent itself to all kinds of conversations, the reason I used it in this study was because it illustrated that not all worship is just spontaneous and reactionary. We've seen a lot of that, saw a lot of that in the Old Testament, saw that when it came to the birth of Jesus, saw that in relationship to Jesus coming into Jerusalem prior to His crucifixion. We saw moments where people just, in the moment, recognized that is a moment that should be praiseworthy, and there was worship offered in those situations. And yet, there are other moments, like Acts chapter 20, like what Paul's going to try to guide the Corinthians into betterment as it relates to it, but where the worship is structured. There's reason, there's purpose, there's very focused, and there are moments where a local group of believers are collectively coming together for the specific purpose of worship. In Acts chapter 20 and verse 7, the very specific reasoning given for their gathering was to do what? Yeah, when the disciples came forth to break bread. And we had a conversation about how we understand that to mean the Lord's Supper. And we had that discussion on Wednesday evening. And we showed that contrast between what happened when they came together. And then Paul preaches till midnight. Eutychus falls out of the window. He's restored. And then Paul makes his way back up into that area. And he has a more common meal at that point. And I will add, by the way, to that, just for food for thought, and it came up a little bit on as people were leaving Wednesday evening and mentioned, but I think one of the other evidences that the breaking of bread the disciples came forth to perform and in what Paul does at the end of that text are different. And the other reason I would argue they're different is when Paul partook of that, what I'm calling a more common meal, it happened at what time? So which would have been no longer the first day of the week. Okay, that was a point I wanted us to make sure we understood. The chronology of the text seems to indicate that they've come together, they break bread, Paul preaches till midnight, Eutychus falls out of the window at that point, he raises him up, and then some point in the wee hours of the morning, Paul continues to have conversations and has this common meal to prepare himself to go and leave. And so just wanted to add that. Didn't have a chance to mention that Wednesday night, but wanted to make sure we saw that. Go ahead.
Another thing that you could use to possibly see that this is another example of the Lord's Supper, is you can compare the language that's being used from Acts 27 to when Jesus institutes the Lord's Supper in the Gospels. In the Gospels, it says, when he took and broke it, when he took the bread and he broke it. Here it's saying, when they came together to break bread. It's the same terminology that's being used.
Right. And yes, that indicates the connectivity to what Jesus instituted and what was happening here. Absolutely. Any other leftover questions? I was still fielding things as kids were coming up out of Bible class Wednesday night, and so I was trying to make sure. I hear a voice. I can't. There it is. I hear voices. Well, I know. What's in the crowd?
More or less kind of indicates that it wasn't the Lord's Supper there in verse 11, because it says he went out.
Right. You mean what happened at the end?
Yeah.
Yeah, that seems to be more focused upon his actions, not the group's actions, what they came together to perform. Again, that's one more way to see a distinction between what's happening here in this text. Other questions, thoughts out of Acts chapter 20? All right, so let's jump to 1 Corinthians chapter 11, because it's a different, completely different, same topic, right? Same topic, but a different situation and a different scene. And it's a lengthy section. I won't read it all in one big chunk, but I will try to at least make sure we understand what's happening. Now, let's just acknowledge a couple of basic things when it comes to Paul and Corinth. There's a lot wrong, right? And I don't mean that in a mean way. I mean that in a reality way, based in the letter that Paul writes. There is a lot wrong going on in the church at Corinth. They have divisiveness over what topic? Well, they were actually in agreement on that, wrongly so. Okay, they've got disagreement on the Lord's Supper and the way they were behaving, but there was a specific. Okay, right, and they were basing who they were following based on who had baptized. Okay, there we go. I'm just trying to see if we can remember what the letter starts. So Paul told them, "I'm glad I didn't baptize any of you, except for a couple of guys, because I don't want some, group deciding that they're going to be followers of me rather than Christ just because I was the guy that happened to baptize them." So they're divisive over baptism. Then you've got the issues that related to the man who had his father's wife. And obviously, he said even the Gentiles wouldn't think that was okay. What are you here you all are supposed to be followers of Jesus, and you can't even for some reason see the error of that kind of behavior. And so he addresses that challenge. He talks about strife and sedition among them, right? The challenges in Corinth are vast and difficult to sort through. They have issues with spiritual gifts and how they were prioritizing them and the disorder it was creating in their worship scenes. So there's just a whole lot to unpack if you looked at all of the things that Paul challenged the church at Corinth with. But I just want to focus. I acknowledge all that other, but I want to focus in on these 17 or 18 verses and think about what's happening here that's challenging their ability to worship God in the right way. So he introduces this segment with a very powerful statement. Notice what he said, verse 17. "Now in this that I declare unto you, I what? I praise you not." We wouldn't necessarily say it that way, but basically Paul's saying, listen, what I'm about to talk about, this isn't something you should be proud about. This isn't something to celebrate. This isn't something to pat your... This is actually something to the contrary of praiseworthiness. There's no praise to come. Because when you come together, it's not what? It's not for the better, it's for the worse. When you're assembling as believers, there ought to be a sense that has a positive reasoning and purpose behind it. And you have trampled on what God had intended, and you've actually made your assemblies worse rather than making them better. And there's a series of reasons for that, and he begins that in verse 18 by saying, first of all, when you come together in the church, I hear that there be divisions among you, and I partly believe it. Okay, so first thing hindering their worship was their, back to our earlier comment, was their divisiveness. I remember an old story. I could tell you the names, but I learned last week I'm not good at remembering names. I used a name last Sunday morning and realized, no, that ain't the right guy. And anyway, I had to edit it out of the sermon online. But anyway, so I'll unless I have it written down from now on, no more names. But anyway, but a church was divided, and they were divided. True story. They were divided over what temperature to keep the building in the wintertime. And so their answer was 2 coal stoves and 2 coal piles. Because the argument seemed to be about how much coal was being used to keep the building. And some people thought it should have been kept colder and not spend so much money on the coal, and others thought it was not right. So they had two coal stoves and 2 coal piles. And the preacher came in a meeting and he said, brethren, he says, I'm concerned about you. He said, 1 Lord, 1 faith, 2 coal piles. Right? You're divided over silliness. Trivial matters that's splitting up churches. I know of other places where churches were literally where the back corner was one group and maybe another group would be sitting in another portion of the building and another sit. And I've known of cases where they were taking up 2 or 3 different collections because there was an intention of leaving. And so they wanted to make sure they had their own treasury built up before they did that. Divisive. And how in the world, here's my point, how do you worship God properly when that's the first thing you notice, think about, and have to deal with when you walk in the building? You can't. It's exactly right. And not because the 2 Brians said, because that's what Paul's saying, right? You can't do it. When you come together and there's these divisive, you're ruining your worship. Resolve the divisiveness, then come together and start worshiping God in the right ways. Resolve the challenge. And that's, unfortunately, historically and anecdotally, I can illustrate to you on multiple occasions where groups resolved to just live in divisiveness and still tried to worship in the same place at the same time, in the same moment, in the same ways. And Paul's warning us here. You're creating conflict within the worship. It's not edifying the people that have assembled, and it's certainly not praiseworthy towards God. Resolve the divisiveness. Yeah, so it's going to be challenged for sure. Go ahead, Brian.
Paul said at the outset of the letter, in chapter 1, verse 10, "Now I beseech you, brethren, by the name of our Lord Christ, that ye all speak the same thing, and that there be no divisions among you, that ye be perfectly joined together in the same mind and the same judgment."
Yeah. And when you challenge yourself to Paul's standard in the very beginning of the letter, your worship will improve as well. Yeah.
I mean, speaking about the congregations,
Right.
like your instance.
Yeah. A lot of that divisiveness doesn't even have to do with anything of matter or import. And that's sad when worship becomes distracting and challenging because of that. Yeah, I hear you. Now he mentions, verse 19, that there are what often are referred to as heresies, things that are contrary to that what God would want. For there must be also heresies among you, that they which are approved may be made manifest among you. It's interesting phrases, right? And I don't...
What?
Yeah, he's not... I don't think he's saying of necessity there's heresies. I think he's saying when you witness and see what's happening in Corinth, there's obviously heresies. There's obviously things being said, done, and behaviors that are contrary to what God would want. Else, why would you have all these issues and challenges and problems? And obviously, at some point then, God will know, those who are honoring Him and striving to do these things in the right way will come to the surface. Not our topic today, but just part of this conversation that He's having with them. So, when you come together, verse 20, therefore into one place, this is not to eat the Lord's Supper. That should have been, I think that's the implication here, what should have been your focus is just what Troas was doing in Acts chapter 20 and verse 7. But when you're coming together into what, you are not, you're not coming for that noble and wise purpose. Why is that true? For, there's our connector, verse 21, in eating, everyone taketh before other his own supper, and one is hungry and another is drunken. What, have ye not houses to eat and to drink in, or despise ye the church of God, and shame them that have not? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you in this? I praise you not. So what seems to be, what's going on? Rather than coming together to partake of the Lord's Supper, what are they doing instead?
Just regular feasting. It's a gathering festival.
Yeah. It's just feasting like you'd have in any other venue, not that which God had prescribed or desired from them. And in fact, it is driving a greater level of divisiveness because everybody's behaviors are different. And one man comes and he's got a big basket full of things, and another poor man comes, he's got nothing. And you're actually driving a larger wedge. Not only are you doing things that God didn't tell you to come together to do, but you're actually creating even greater conflicts among the local brethren there because of these choices that you're making. So he just asks them simply, if feasting's what you're planning to do, then leave the church out of it for simplistic sake. That's not what you're supposed to be coming to. If your purpose is to come together to commemorate Jesus, if your purpose is to come together and to worship before God, then do that. But what they had become involved in was not. So what's he do to help them get back on track? Because what I love about what Paul does here is he doesn't just tell them what's wrong. What's he do? Yeah, he tells them how to fix it. Right? Here's what's wrong. You've turned worship into a big party, and rather than focusing your minds and centering your thoughts upon God and upon Jesus and the memorial that He establishes, you're doing things completely different than that. So what Paul then says is, here's how you resolve it. You get back to what? Yeah, go back to the origins. Go back to what Jesus actually told you to do. Go back to the instructions that came from Jesus. For I have received of the Lord that which also I delivered unto you, that the Lord Jesus, the same night in which He was betrayed, took bread. When He had given thanks, He broke it and said, Take, eat, this is my body which is broken for you. This do in remembrance of me. After the same manner also He took the cup when He had supped, saying, This cup is the New Testament in my blood. This do ye as oft as ye drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as ye eat this bread and drink this cup, you do show the Lord's death till He come. Now I'll pause there. There's more, but we'll get to that in a minute. So, how would you describe that memorial, by the way? What kinds of words would you think of when you think about that memorial, in particular in contrast to what they were doing? Simple. Great word. Sacred, right? This commemoration of Jesus is important and divinely appointed, not common, like they had turned it. Structured. Solemn and reflective, right? Those are all great words. Anything else you think of? The love, right? Not this divisive, who's got the largest picnic basket, but are we focusing on the love that Jesus has demonstrated? Right. So it's actually what the purpose is for, right? This is the actual remembrance that who established? that Jesus himself established. I think that's important. If we're gonna honor Jesus, and we're going to do that in the proper ways, then the only way to accomplish that is to do it His way. The only way to really honor Him is to do that in the manner in which, and so that's all Paul's saying. He says, listen, you've gone down a path that has created your local assemblies into something that's making you worse rather than making you better. When you come into the local assemblies, you ought to leave it better. You ought to leave that better. And by the way, I'll pause and just since we are the theme of worship, leaving better doesn't mean we that was the best singing I ever heard, the best sermon I ever heard. No. What makes worship better is the focus, attention. Their problem was their focus was on themselves. Their focus was on themselves. They just wanted to have a big feast. Worship becomes better when the focus gets on God and on His Son. Yeah, right, that's the phrase, right? This do in remembrance of me, Jesus says, Him. He becomes the focus. The reason their worship assemblies were getting worse and not leading them to betterment didn't have anything to do with the mechanics so much as their reasoning and purposes and their focus when they were assembling. And he says, go home and do that. You've got houses to eat and drink. Go home and do that. When you come before the Lord in the assemblies, get your focus upon the remembrance of Jesus. And when it comes in particular to the focus of the Lord's Supper, then get centered on that. And I'll add, by the way, since again it's our theme, it's interesting to note in Acts 20, the very purposeful description given as to why they assembled is what? To break bread. It just so happened that they were privileged by the fact that the Apostle Paul was in town and they got the opportunity to listen to him preach late into the evening, and then some even got to sit around the table with him for a while, even into the dawn before he left. But even in Corinth, Paul's trying to encourage them, listen, your weekly assemblies, your first day of the week assemblies have just turned into these raucous feasts. You need to get those re-centered upon what the real reason should be to gather upon the first day of the week, and that is to break bread in commemoration of Jesus. What's your point, preacher? My point is, we need to remember that. Our first day of the week assemblies have functions that are authorized, but there seems to be a very focused purpose that the New Testament churches had when they came together. And I've said lots of times, and I'd gladly shorten every sermon and give that time to the Lord's table if that's what we needed to do. Because I'm not, I think we do a pretty good, our guys have done a pretty good job. COVID actually helped us in that, by the way. That's an interesting way to look at it, but it did. We've kind of gotten away from that just rapid fire Lord's Supper, and all of the guys that are taking charge of the table now have been very good about slowing down and being thoughtful about it. But it's a primary reason they're coming together. That's my thought process here. It just took me forever to get there. Right? There's a thoughtful purpose of why they're coming together, and Paul's challenging Corinth to get back to that purpose and remember why the disciples are gathering upon the first day of the week. I'm sorry, Barbara. Sorry.
Back in Acts 20 and 7, do you think the context implies that that's why Paul actually stayed?
Yes, I do. Yeah, I would maybe it's a bit speculative, but I would think there was, because that's the language. It tells us that, right? He tells us he stayed long enough to be there when those disciples were going to gather, and I do think that was purposeful. Again, on some of the on your way out of the door conversations Wednesday night, was one of the things that came up in one of those secondary conversations that I had with a couple folks, was that there were times where Paul would be traveling and there wouldn't be any churches to assemble with. They hadn't even been established yet in the locations that he was going. And so it seems to me like when he's got an opportunity to stay put for enough days to allow him to be with that local assembly of people, he chose to do that and to stay and worship with them. Go ahead, Bob.
I think the emblems, and of course we already discussed about the unleavened bread being pure, representing Christ's body, which is without sin. But the cup, the fruit of the vine, is not represented by an alcoholic content. Christ was pure, and I think the alcohol represents an unpure drink. I think it's fruit of the vine, not wine.
Yeah. We'll save that for another day. Because I'll spend I can spend 20 hours talking about words and definitions and differences between then and now, but I understand what you're saying. So, but we'll put that into another class sometime.
The thing about the Corinthians, I understand we're looking at the Lord's Supper right now, but the thing about the Corinthians, if you boil it down, they're very prideful. I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, I've got this gift, I've got that gift. Oh, I've got a big basket of food here and you ain't got squat. That type of thing. A problem he addresses here. Yeah. It seems like it boils down to self. Yeah. They have yet to turn it around to look at something else instead of self.
Yeah. And I think that is their issue. Self was at the center of everything with them.
Not only do I think this could apply just for the Lord's Supper, even though the example here is the Lord's Supper, I think this could apply to just about every part of our worship. There was a specific intent for it, and so we can't be divided between ourselves among certain, going, oh, this is how I'm going to sing. Oh, this half the congregation is going to use instruments. This half's going to just sing naturally. They all need to go back to the same point and be in unity with it.
Yeah, that unity lends itself to quality, for lack of a better word, worship. We can sing words in our songs that mean something. Sing songs of hope and encouragement, but not to that guy over there, because I don't agree with him, right? Or we offer our prayers up, but not to that group in the back of the building because they disagree with it, right? That unification helps that worship function in the proper ways. Go ahead, Sid.
What version do you have up there?
That's King James.
King James?
Yeah.
Bert, you have the New Testament. The New King James has the covenant, which I like, because again, he's reminding them that, to me, that the old law's gone. This is about the new covenant. This is about Christ.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
The reason they have testaments is because it's after the death of the testator.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what New King James does, it just blends the readings of the Masoretic and Vaticanus and Sinaiticus with the received Textus Receptus.
But they've entered into a new relationship with Jesus, and I suppose it's probably, of course, with Corinth. I don't know what kind of connectivity they would have had to Old Testament law, but the paganism would have had lots of feast type celebratory kinds of things, and they seem to be adopting from that culture. Oh, no doubt. No, I'm not arguing that. Yeah, but there were very common practices that happened outside of Christianity that they seem to be employing into their worship and their gatherings, and Paul's trying to, I'm not praising you in that. This is what we need to get back to, and that's it, back into the new covenant and testament of Jesus.
It's all about perversion. Corinth was one of the most perverse places on earth, and how I understand we're talking just specifically about the Lord's Supper, but how is this perversion any different than the perversion with the money changers in the temple? Eventually, the act, whatever the act is, that's supposed to be toward God or Jesus, becomes worldly, becomes fleshly. I mean, for example, we mentioned it earlier. I can take that computer screen instead of Scripture. We can have a bunch of pictures of lovey-dovey things that have nothing to do with Scripture. It's on this book, but it makes people feel good. It makes them feel welcome. And I think even to this day, people try to get the numbers and try to compromise on things. And so what they do is they compromise with what God said. And
which is the worst compromise of all.
Yeah. And I think the Lord's Supper can be compromised. It's just, and we've seen it with the whore of Babylon to this day.
Sure, I agree. Yes, go ahead, Danny.
We see a great reluctance about Jesus and what He's done. And what about God's love? Why did God send His Son? Because His love.
Yeah. And again, they're missing out on that understanding because they're focusing attentions on completely different things when they've gathered. Verse 26, I left off there, reminds them the reasoning, right? Here's the reason why you're partaking the Lord's Supper. You're showing forth the Lord's death until He comes. Verse 27, wherefore whosoever shall eat this bread and drink this cup of the Lord unworthily shall be guilty of the body and the blood of the Lord. You know what Paul to me is simply saying? This is more serious than you think it is, right? This isn't just a matter of personal preferences and things we like and dislike. This Paul says when you're claiming to come together to honor and remember Jesus, you're claiming that you've gathered to commune with the Lord, but you're not, because you've turned it into these feasts and filling your bellies rather than focusing on what Jesus, and that may not seem like a big deal, but he says it's absolutely a big deal, because when you eat and drink unworthily, you become guilty of the body and blood of the Lord. It's interesting. Unworthily is an interesting word, right? Because there's an assumption then that there's a counter, right? What's the opposite of unworthily? Worthily. So how do you partake of the Lord's Supper worthily?
That's going to be different with everyone. Intent is the same.
Okay. So intent and thought process, how else, according to what Paul's describing here?
Well, some translations say discerning, without discerning.
Okay. But I'm just trying to get us to think. Here, okay, let me tell you what it's not. It isn't, I'm worthy of Jesus, right? When I partake of the Lord's Supper, this isn't me proclaiming, I am worthy of what Jesus did for me. So eating and drinking worthily has more to do with the intent and motive of the heart, and whether I'm doing what He told me to do, right? Doing what He has instructed, doing and memorializing Him in the fashion that He has described is vital to proper worship. Remembering the death of Jesus until He comes is crucial to proper worship. And the reason why we caution folks when we partake of the Lord's Supper to really evaluate those things, because discerning the Lord's death till He comes is more than just an acknowledgement that He died, right? to partake of his death, burial, and resurrection in a way that would not be described as unworthily would require me to honor his death, burial, and resurrection. How do we do that, by the way? What's Romans 6 say about that? How did people come into contact with the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus? Baptism. Baptism. Sometimes you'll hear people say, "Well, you don't partake of the Lord's Supper until you're baptized." Well, I understand that accommodative language. That doesn't really hit to the heart of it. The reason for that is because that's the way we recognize and honor the death, burial, and so how can I commemorate the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus in this memorial properly if I have yet to do that in my own choices? So that's really what's behind that. Not just, well, only baptized people get it. Don't think of it that way. No, think of it as those who have recognized the need to die with Christ, to be buried with Christ, to be raised with Him. When they recognize the benefit of that relationship with Jesus, then they can commemorate Him in the proper way. And that's part of that discussion.
I'm not concerned with who is or who isn't. I'm concerned with my thoughts at the time that I'm worshiping God. We do it collectively, but yet in our hearts we're doing it individually.
That's the next thought. We didn't get there. That's the next thought in the text. Lord willing, Wednesday we'll come back to that because you're right. I think we spend too much time looking around and not enough time looking in, but so that's the next thought on the page. And Lord's willing, we'll talk about that on Wednesday. Appreciate all the thoughts this morning.
Somewhere